Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. We are going to start today's program. I want to thank you all for being here. I'm Nancy Turrell. I am the Executive Director of the Arts Council of Martin County, and we're happy to have all of you. And we're really happy to have this wonderful 30th annual All Florida Juried Art Show on our walls. And even more than that, we're just really happy to be back open and offering arts programming to the community and having this space filled again after 6 months of not being open because of COVID. So we're grateful that you are here, and I appreciate that you're all following good safety protocols and hope that we all continue to stay well and healthy. This, as I said, is the 30th annual All Florida Juried Show. We have been doing this show since the very beginning of being in this wonderful historic space in downtown Stuart, and have been able to grow this show over the years so that it does represent contemporary artists who are working from all different parts of the state of Florida. Literally, there's artists from Tallahassee to Miami represented in here. You'll note on the exhibition titles it says where the artist's hometown is, so you can get a sense of how much of the state is represented here in these two gallery spaces. In addition to the gallery space, we use this space for concerts and other programs throughout the year, so please check out martinarts.org to see a list of programming not only here but in all the other venues in Martin County. We are here to promote and support the arts organizations and artists in our community so that we have a vibrant, thriving arts community, and thank you for being a part of that today. I would like to introduce our lecturer and our juror today. Lisa Rockford is the founder of Rockford Projects and is an independent curator, artist, and educator. She is a passionate and avid arts advocate. She's organized multidisciplinary exhibitions, public lectures, artist workshops, and interactive experiences, all designed to be accessible to a broad audience, spark dialogue, and act as catalysts for cultural exchange. Lisa earned her BFA from Bowling Green State University and an MFA from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. In 2007, she returned to South Florida and was among the first to be selected for a residency at Sailboat Bend Artist Loft in Fort Lauderdale. During her 7-year residency there, she was the principal organizer in converting 3 floors of common space into an artist-run public exhibition space called 1310 Gallery. Lisa has since been invited to curate exhibitions at the White Space, the Moores Collection in West Palm Beach, the Project's Contemporary Art Space in Fort Lauderdale, that village, and Bailey Contemporary Arts in Pompano Beach, among many others. Lisa is currently a tenured assistant professor of visual arts at Broward College, where she instituted their first visiting artist series on the campus, annually bringing national artists to give lectures and workshops, and instituted Arts Fest, an annual festival, mural contest, and DIY marketplace. So we are very happy to have Lisa here today and can't wait to hear what you have to tell us. So welcome and thank you.
Appreciate it. You get the links or?
And I will get the links.
All right, thank you. So I am interested in a range of themes in contemporary art, especially when I curate or am interested in a wide variety of artists, and I was really thrilled to see the range of styles that were submitted to the show. So I wanted to make sure to jury in a sampling of a wide variety of techniques, approaches, subject matter. But with this lecture specifically, I'm looking at a trend in art that several contemporary artists are using. So I'm going to show artists from across the globe, and what all of them have in common basically is that they use an aesthetic language for expressing their content that I call camouflage, but really thinking about the art of invisibility or visibility of how much you see the subject in the artwork. So in the same way that camouflage has been used in nature, where texture, patterning, and coloration act as concealment, these artists have a similar aesthetic approach. So you'll witness how these artists have similarly manipulated colorful amalgamations, not this on the screen, I'm still demonstrating some examples from nature, but coming up you're going to see artists that have manipulated amalgamations of prints, patterns, textiles, and different textures in order to hide the subject in the artwork. So in some of the artworks you're going to need to play a little bit of hide and seek with your eyes as far as finding the artwork. But here we see in nature, like an octopus, for example, in both of these, that is able to actually change its coloration. So I'm going to be organizing artworks in some of these kinds of themes, whether artists play with coloration, patterns, textures, things like that. So camouflage is used often to protect yourself from predators, right, or to hide. So in the next works, there's a definitive play between figure and ground, and the subject may at first be overlooked amongst visually overwhelming and maximalist environments, kind of like the slide in nature, where there's a lot going on. So it might take a minute for you to notice the subject. But really this is about a symbolic assert for survival amongst adverse environments and oppressive influences. So I have some kind of sections about the way that artists are doing approaches. So the first one is really like the influence of military camouflage, which might be the first thing you think of when you think of camouflage, is to think of the actual military pattern. Here's a little gift there for you, of the idea of playing with camouflage. But thinking about the actual pattern, one of the first examples we see of that is from Andy Warhol in his self-portraits. So you are probably familiar with Warhol's work, that he did a whole variety of subjects, often celebrities, but also did many self-portraits. And so in this case, this all-over pattern, he was interested in camouflage because he thought it related to abstract expressionist painting, thinking about like Jackson Pollock paintings, or the kind of abstract expressionism that had recently been just before his time. And so he started creating self-portraits with print covering, partially covering his face. And a lot of people think that this was really about juxtaposing his public persona, the way that he was kind of a celebrity, with his own private insecurities, kind of thinking about masking himself in a certain way. Now these are more recent works, about 30 years later, by Yuka Shonbar, who is an artist from the UK. And he is intentionally appropriating Warhol's style of self-portraiture in order to draw parallels with more recent topics. So being a black artist, for example, you know, that gives it a whole different spin on it as well. But he was born to Nigerian parents in the UK and spent his life moving back and forth between the two countries. So over his face you see this kind of fabric that you think of as African fabric, and that is his trademark fabric that he uses, and he uses it ironically or subversively. So he is most known for works like you see on the right, where he uses this fabric that's thought of as representing African identity, but he is really thinking about stereotypes and the history of where a lot of these ideas of identity come from. So, for example, he discovered that this fabric, this batik type of fabric that you think of as African, did not actually originate in Africa, but was a product from a trade with colonization. So it was originally inspired by Indonesian design and was brought by Dutch traders to Africa because they couldn't sell it in Europe, so they brought it to Africa, and it eventually became absorbed into the culture, and eventually in the 1960s became a symbol of African independence. But in Shonbari's works, he is using this to talk about globalization and the post-colonial state that we live in, and thinking about the fact that cultural identity is not as clear-cut as it may seem. So he takes figures, for example, and creates costumes in this fabric, ironically, especially costuming from the, I think, 19th century. But by juxtaposing that fabric, you know, normally that would have been pastels and silks originally, European costuming, and by juxtaposing that fabric, he's using it more ironically. So more in his self-portraits, we saw the idea of camouflage, but in this case, he's playing with the idea of patterning and thinking about how that's associated with culture. So Patricia Saunders is an author. She's actually from Florida, and she says one of the ways contemporary art has been an effective tool for social justice is through its capacity to entice viewers into a more considered mode of looking. In other words, it can revise the grammar of visual literacy away from its disciplining model toward a mode of visual engagement that encourages more critical ways of looking, allowing us to see the people we are looking at. So in the next works I'll show you, artists are using these tactics of camouflaging as metaphors for thinking about visibility in the social order or societal blindness of individuals, and kind of like going into symbolism in that way. So Lee Young-baek is a Korean artist, and he is referencing military camouflage, but instead switching out the pattern to be floral. And he is playing with examining the artifice of contemporary society. These images are stills from a video, which unfortunately I couldn't get a portion of the video to show because of he doesn't have it out in public. You only see it in galleries and museums. But as you watch it, in the floral landscape, it's kind of slow motion. And so as you watch it, at first you just see flowers, and you start to see soldiers appearing where you only see like bits of their hands or the guns because their fatigues are in matching flower print, and they have very barely discernible movements. So it's thinking about the tactical abilities of military, but instead by adding flowers, it definitely is more subversive. So there's another still from it where you can start to see a mask in there, a bit of a face if you look. This work was actually shown at the 2011 Venice Biennale, where he had the outfits hanging. He had performers dressed in the outfits, and then there was a room with the video that you could walk into. So he says the flower is something that contemporary artists make fun of and want to stay away from sometimes, but I wanted to use it from the exact opposite perspective. Also, the flower is associated with the peace movement and related to gestures of love and memorials of death. So he's thinking about all the different associations we might have with flowers, and also thinking about, really creating a contradiction between the idea of the violence with the soldiers amongst the flowers. So I imagine he's probably thinking about some of the results of war, or thinking about memorials in that way. So it's important to understand what conditions his practice come from, that he originally, his mother lost her siblings and father during what he calls the military dictatorship in the First Republic of Korea from 1948 to 1960. And at that time he was a student, and when he was 21 years old, he witnessed riots and tear gas in Seoul in 1987. So he really was thinking about how the political arena was kind of falling apart, and started to raise questions about neutral aesthetic spaces. Thinking about creating spaces apart from ideology and borders, and all the complexities that are tied up with politics and war. So it really, his personal history is kind of going in as motivation in the works as well. Viva Gaurota is originally from India, and she is creating works instead that are influenced by her upbringing and home. So she was born in the modernist city of Chandigarh in 1978, and now lives in New Delhi. And you know, as you know, India is the most populated place in the world as far as how many people within a square footage. So in this case, she created an installation with a 53-foot photographic mural, expansive of New Delhi, and photoshopped it mirrored to stretch it even further, and really express this kind of chaotic, cluttered urban landscape. But within the vista, you have this kind of presence of the figures in matching military patterning, which start to feel like they're surveilling you or watching you, but they also can kind of double as citizens as well. So she's really thinking about growing up in a place where, you know, there's 1.3 billion inhabitants, and if statistics show that 33% of the population are living in less space than Americans who live in prison cells. So a very different way of living than we might in the US. She's thinking about that expansive space, but also this feeling of being watched. So she's playing with visual deception to talk about her concerns with urbanization and those that are left behind in its wake. So she obfuscates our vision in order to investigate the hierarchies of power hidden in plain sight. Controlling access to what is seen, watching while being watched. The figures are put on notice carefully, for things are not what they seem. So this idea of like the person being lost into the background is something that many of these artists have in common, and these first artists are really thinking more specifically connecting it to military presence or that kind of influence. There's one more view of that piece where you can really see the figures getting lost in there. Now, this next artist really uses a whole different approach where he actually uses military reconnaissance film that was originally invented to use aerial views over the landscape and look for signs of life amongst the vegetation. So this is a Kodak aerochrome film that was discontinued, and the film actually turns the colors of live vegetation into shades of pink and violet. So that is not the artist manipulating the colors, that's actually what the film does, that it changes the landscape and the vegetation in this way into pinks and purples. So he started photographing in the Democratic Republic of Congo in Africa, which of course is an area that is inundated by violence. And so he went to that specific place to photograph what was happening there, and thinking about finding beauty within tragedy and war and destruction. So you have these masculine figures rendered in shades of pink or holding weapons. Often they're just kids, but really he's finding, you know, certain beauty within that, which these horrific things, unspeakable things are happening, and he's trying to find a way to photograph it, because purely documentary photographs are really not they're maybe going to be a little too hard to swallow. He photographed rebel groups fighting nomadically in a jungle war zone, inundated with ambushes, massacres, and systematic sexual violence. These tragic narratives urgently need telling, but he needed to find a way to really show the humanity within all the violence that is happening. He said, I wanted to export this technology to a harder situation, to upend the generic conventions of calcified mass media narratives and challenge the way we're allowed to represent this forgotten conflict. I wanted to confront this military reconnaissance technology, to use it reflexively in order to question the ways in which war photography is constructed. So this series offers a radical rethinking of how to depict a conflict as complex and enduring as the war in Congo. And he, instead of where this film was originally designed to be from an aerial perspective and actually, you know, to help kill people originally, to drop bombs, he's instead photographing from the ground, from eye level, instead of an aerial view, and photographing people head on to really meet them eye to eye and think about the people who are touched by the tragedy. So another tactic of camouflage is to use concealing coloration. So this is yet another video of a creature underwater. What do you call it? Octopus? I'm forgetting. An octopus that can change its coloration to hide. And it's fascinating, how much it looks almost like it's something that was digitally rendered, but the fact that that is inherent in nature. This is something that is inspiring artists, whether they consciously realize it or not. And one of the first artists to start working in this way is Belin from China, who is now known as the Invisible Man. And he has really made the process of making himself invisible has actually made his career very visible. His images are kind of used everywhere. So he started this series, Hiding in the City, in 2005, and there are many artists who copy him now. But he did this as a silent protest, because in 2005, the Chinese government decided to demolish an artist village neighborhood in preparation for the Olympics, and his studio was part of that village, so he didn't have a say in that. So as a result, he started what he called a silent protest, photographing himself becoming invisible in the city, basically saying that people are not seen as individuals, they're seen as serving the masses, and so he's illustrating the fact that he is invisible to the government or not seen as an individual in this way, that he started to photograph himself around the city, starting with the village that was being demolished and showing different places that also were being demolished for the sake of westernization or urbanization. So sometimes it takes you a minute to really find the figure in there. But he started making a journey around the city, and now he also does this around the world. So his first series was really very specific to China, and he does meticulous research and spends hours in front of the background while his assistants paint him into the background. And in all the photos, he's wearing the same type of kind of Chinese military uniform. So he's blending in both metaphorically and literally. That's one of my favorites. So you see how complicated some of these backgrounds are, that it's hard to believe that it's all painted on the surface of the uniform. But I guess he photographs the background and has that as help for doing the paintings as well. So some people asked him, like, are you ever going to stop doing this? Because he actually started out as a sculptor, and he said that he never gets tired of this technique. I never thought to stop disappearing. Instead, I always think about other ideas to work on. The society we live in is changing tremendously every day. In my works, the backgrounds express the most important information. The background I use today might be gone tomorrow. So really, it's a great metaphor for thinking about not being, the individual not being seen by the larger masses, like the government, for example, and really being seen as just part of the city or part of what serves the country. In more recent years, he's touched upon modern-day technologies that he finds worrying. So this one's from 2012, and he says, in the modern era, everyone is just a piece of data, which is valued less and less every day. Meanwhile, technologies achieved by desire, or the possibilities of some sort of human development, is winning over the hearts of modern-day people. So he's concerned by how much our constant connection to data or modern devices is going to take over our humanity. So his artwork has more recently started to include other people. In this case, he painted 23 residents of what is called a cancer village in China, where there are dangerous factories and many people who got cancer as a result. And so he says that my art reflected human suffering through commemoration and grief, and really thinking about the experience of the people who live there. So Chinese artists like him really exhibit their work more outside of China, because it can even be dangerous to be creating art that kind of speaks out against the government. So artists like Ai Weiwei that you might have heard of, Belin is another one of the most well-known Chinese artists globally. So he started creating artworks all over the world or to represent other issues. He says, I always use my works to question and rethink the inequality and imbalance caused by the process of human development. And here you can see he peeled off some of the paint that was painted on him like a mask. So he's hidden in locales around the world, and all of them really are silent yet powerful statements of identity, existence, and issues about his country, as well as issues that happen globally. Here in the US, one of the American artists I'll show you is Hank Willis Thomas. And he's an example of someone who has worked in many different materials, and he picks the materials specifically for how they can be symbolic or connect with the viewer in different ways. And he always keeps his work very accessible in a way where he's talking about very heavy issues, but heavy content, but is approaching it in a way where people can connect with it easily, and where it can still have depth to it and not be overly obvious. His mother was actually a photographic historian, so he has actually used a lot of photographic research in his work, where he spends hours going through archival images. So with this series, for example, he took archival images of people protesting around the world from the 1910s to the 1970s. Just check if there's anything else I wanted to say from here. Where the struggle for human rights is something that has continued up until today. So he says that human rights are never given. There's something that we always have to fight for. So this one you see more specific to thinking about indigenous people in the US. And this series, you can see it says without flash, with flash. This is actually the same piece, but it's made to be interactive, that when a person approaches it, they use the flash of their camera to see the whole work. So when it starts out, he makes these with a retroreflective ink that is usually used for things like stop signs. And he started using this for screen prints, and with historical images of protests and civil rights and different things that were kind of hot button issues, especially thinking about African American history. So in this case, for example, you have what looks like American young women, black women, walking down the street carrying their school books. It seems like nothing special is going on. They're just on their way to school. But then when you flash a light over the picture, then you see the full image, which actually has women holding up, white women holding up signs that say, "We want segregation now." So in this case, the rest of the work is not seen until you shine a light on the subject. So this kind of a conceptual idea of visibility. Another example, Freedom for Soweto. We see a young black man standing peacefully with his arms outstretched, signaling the peace sign with his fingers. And when illuminated, you see men in riot gear and an aggressive dog lunging toward him. So these are historical images maybe that people want to forget about or kind of like put into the history books. And artists like Hank Willis Thomas feel it's important to keep those images visible. And even, you know, we're so saturated by images today that we are desensitized to them. And so this process helps us to look at parts of the image maybe that we might just not pay attention to because we get so overwhelmed with images. So in this case, these are disabled vets that their signs are kind of whitewashed until you use the flash and you actually see the messages that they are saying. So this one I think is one of the most impactful ones where he's thinking about the way that we have a shared history. You know, we have the symbol like the American flag, but then when you see the rest of the image, gives you like a violent sensation or kind of frightening, really, when you look at it. And so he is really upending a traditional method for viewing art, where in art galleries normally we're told don't shine your flashlight and don't use your flash. Don't shine a light at the artworks because it can harm them. He's really flipping that around and activating our technology as a political device for reframing historical narratives. So the next works I'll show you are on a similar vein, thinking about why we have racial tensions today as being a result of institutions of the past, like colonization, for example, European colonial rule, and the after effects and social impact that we have today. The post-colonial condition is something that's interwoven with globalization and has really created a lot of effects. So there are several artists who are examining that idea, like Hugh Locke. If you ever go to the Perez Museum of Art, they have some of his work on view there, so you might have seen his work there in Miami. But he was born in Edinburgh and is based in London, but he spent a lot of his childhood in Guyana. And growing up, it was shortly after they had just become independent from colonial rule. So there was still a whole legacy of the British Empire in Georgetown. So he really says he grew up in a post-colonial society. So the architecture was Tudor Gothic. He went to a school run by Anglican nuns. And he was taught about Alfred the Great and English kings in school that was irrelevant to his life in Guyana. So the language and symbolism became enduring, that it is still central to his work. So this work, for example, called Black Queen, he's co-opting an image of the Queen from British iconography of the monarchy and making her, it's actually a sculptural work, I think it's like 8 feet high or something, but it's all made out of cheaply produced plastic toys, lizards and creatures, but the whole base of it is actually made out of plastic machine guns. And he is relating this similar to the idea of fetish figures from Africa with nails embedded in them, which are more magical figures that can be used to either harm someone or heal someone. But in this case, he's using plastic toys, which are cheaply produced in China. So he's thinking about the fact that globalization has made these materials accessible on a worldwide scale, to the fact that you can make a whole artwork out of them, which 15 to 20 years ago you could not do that. But it's because of cheap labor and that process of globalization. So in this case, the portrait of the Queen is instead transformed into these kind of floral patterns and materials. And he has a few other series that approach these themes in different ways. So for example, the Restoration series, he created proposals of what to do with statues of ancestors who were slave traders or held slaves, which is a big hot button issue right now especially. And he did this series 15 years ago, practically in 2006 is this one, where he took the photographs of the sculptures because he wasn't able to get permission to actually cover the works. That was his idea originally, but then he covered the photographs with actual materials. And so this one, for example, is Edward VII, who reigned over an empire rich and varied and conquered, much, was one of the last monarchs as part of the colonization. And in this case, he's covering the photo with cheap jewelry, attached in the same way that you might attach objects to a Madonna. So it's encrusted in fake gold that's cheap, kind of being a little bit ironic, but also talking about the gold that this ruler would have acquired through, questionable means. So he's really helping us, remind us of the history that these sculptures illustrate. And these public artworks are something that really becomes invisible into the landscape, because we're used to seeing them around. These ones are from Bristol specifically, but we're used to seeing these public statues, and now because of activism, there's been a lot of questioning of what to do with these statues. You know, should they be taken down? Is that censorship, or should we find a creative way to talk about the history? So this was his he was kind of prophetic in that way, discussing this really before it became an issue talked about much in culture. So, for example, this piece that he did of Colston, Edward Colston was a 17th century slave trader, but he also did a lot of good works in the city. So there were many places in Bristol named after him: Colston School, Colston Hall, Colston Towers, and he created this piece really he covered him in cowrie beads, which were at one point in Africa used for trading slaves and also for making cheap jewelry. So he's thinking about the paternalism of that figure and the corruption also that is embedded, you know, from the enslavement of African people. So he would have loved to have decorated the statues for real, but he didn't get permission for that, and now the statue no longer exists because protesters took it down and put it into the harbor. So many of these statues are disappearing or being defaced now as part of protests, and that's something that, of course, is very controversial, what to do with them. But Hugh Locke is one of several artists who are thinking about ways to creatively approach some of these issues. He has one more series that I want to mention where he created a portrait gallery of kings, tyrants, and bandits, where he actually dressed up in costume. So amongst the camouflage figure, he's actually underneath of there. And he's actually, you know, playing this with this idea of luring the viewer in with all these attractive materials, yet there's something darker luring underneath in the content. So he wants to play with the duality and parody himself in the same way. And he used himself specifically because he says, "I felt I was acknowledging the potential for violence that is within each of us." So he always makes sure there's a little bit of himself still showing. Like here you can still see like his fingers sticking out there, or you might see his eyes, to kind of really bring it back to thinking about the person. But you know, using himself, he's also talking about the fact that I'm not judging these people from the past specifically, but thinking about the fact that that's a universal thing, that all of us might have something violent within us. So this last work, for example, is referencing redcoats from the British Army, and the objects attached to him reference shrunken heads, like from Africa. So he's also kind of making a little bit of a joke about stereotypes as well, thinking about tribal costume, and mixing that with like cheap fabrics and materials. So the backdrop, for example, is actually a pirated Versace design. So he's also thinking about hierarchies of wealth and the materials that represent wealth, or the symbols from our culture that are associated with that. These were originally based off of, they were inspired by Tudor portraits from art history, where he's referencing these kind of aristocratic portraits that still hang in many British homes of the elite, where you have portraits of their ancestors, and they're dressed in these sort of costumes that seem a little bit silly to us now. And that's something that he actually mentioned, is that he is attracted to the absurdity of the images and wonders how are they going to be read in 300 years. Both his own work as well as art historical portraits. Much of it is in the context of the time period, and that the interpretation of it might really change as time goes on. So another, an American artist that deals with some similar thinking about race relations is Ebony G. Patterson. Her work has also been shown in Miami at the Perez Museum. And I would see her work a lot at Art Basel as well. Her work is kind of a hot seller right now in contemporary art. But she originally is from Jamaica. and she works in Kentucky in the US, but she draws in the viewer with beautiful materials. But then as you look at her work, you start to see the darker messages, the darker histories that are behind them. So she has colorful clumps of flowers, crochet, woven gems. She kind of combines really beautiful materials with also kind of cheap materials that might at first be kind of glittery. So she said, they say that when you look closer, you'll find the disturbing forces in the works. She seduces the viewer with brightly colored patterns to draw them in, but really they're about social injustice upon the invisible and the voiceless. So these are other examples. The first step in her work is to scour the internet for images of murder victims and people who die of violent deaths, especially people of color in the US. She's thinking about how the circulation of the images and the visibility of their subjects may otherwise go unseen or be ignored, and instead she's really creating memorials for these people through the artwork. So she shapes the tapestry around the figure, and the figure kind of becomes lost in the work. But as you look at it, you see, the idea of a figure that looks like they've just died or is in that kind of a position. She uses a painter's sensibility to really arrange the beadwork and sequins, crochet, all the different materials, toys. So there's a lot going on that you could spend hours, looking into the pieces at the textures and things. Hopefully you guys won't become visually overwhelmed by these works because they're all very maximalist aesthetic. So she says the audience is seduced by the prettiness, but once we dig through the foliage and hues, we unearth the underreported and unacknowledged brutality experienced on the lower rungs of the socioeconomic ladder. And so she is instead calling attention to that invisibility. And you can see a lot of some similarities in the series, but all of them are taken from actual, victims and photography. So one of the main themes that she uses is a garden idea of flowers, which, similar to what we saw earlier by some other artists, the idea that flowers are associated with memorials. In this case, she uses figures in gardens, disappears them into that, and really contrasts the beauty with, again, with the memorial, with the victims, with thinking about some of the darker things that of people laid to rest. She's also thinking about how where she grew up in Jamaica, in the poorest neighborhoods, they actually call some of the neighborhoods things like sea view gardens to try to make it seem like a more promising place, even though there's a lot of violence happening. So in many of the works, you see things like bullets, bullet holes, often referencing like how some of these people died. And this piece is probably one of her most well-known, where she's really just illustrating this basic idea to see the person or the individual. So through her work, she's really putting a lot of dignity and beauty upon these people who were victims of violence, and wants us to look past the facade and think about, looking past our consumer-centric culture to people who are not touched by glitter and gold. So this next group of works is really thinking more specifically about gender. Sorry, the last works are definitely a little bit heavier content as far as the themes, but these next ones are more specific to thinking about maybe feminist motivations or examining our history of the patriarchal legacy and kind of societal norms surrounding gender. So Jessica Putnam Phillips, for example, works in ceramics. She's traveled all over the world working in the military, in military intelligence as a specialist in the US Air Force. And when she was deployed to the Middle East, she started observing the culture and became fascinated with gender roles and thinking about a woman's place in society. Because, of course, being a female, if you travel to parts of the Middle East, you'd have to cover yourself. You wouldn't be able to wear shorts or things like that. You'd have to be more covered up. So when her commitment to the military ended, she ended up switching her career to art. She actually has a lot of educational videos online about how to work in ceramics. So in her works, you see a connection to camouflage, especially because she was in the military, but also instead connecting this to heirloom tableware and the designs that are traditionally in tableware. So she specifically picked tableware because it's connected to domesticity and thinking about the stereotypes about a woman's place being in the home, these connections to domesticity or the domestic role. And so hiding behind the delicately rendered flora are female snipers in fatigues and combat helmets who have a fixed gaze in the distance. So also thinking about the female veteran is not always a focus in culture either. Often when you think about the military, you're thinking about men, specifically in the military. And so having someone in the military actually convert to an art career is also maybe a little more rare. So she's really creating a contradiction between having the weapons mixed in with more feminine patterns, or what you would think of as more feminine patterns. So using the notion of serving, she said she's creating objects associated with serving a meal, depicting military women serving their country. I combine military iconography such as weapons, armored vehicles, uniforms, and insignias with traditional elements of willow-ware patterns. So this reimagining really subverts the once benign decoration by creating a narrative that is personal to her, but also something that other people might connect to, thinking about the kind of social commentary about a woman's place. And you can see she also creates installations with the works there. She says the expectation of duty and service that's thrust upon these women is reflected in the form and surfaces. I seek to challenge the entrenched ideas of domesticity and gender roles while exposing the social and cultural issues faced by military women. One more in this theme by female artists specifically is Patti Carroll, who is known for her highly saturated photographs that she's been working in since the 1970s. And her series of anonymous women deal with creating the idea of a female figure lost in her domestic surroundings. And in this case, she's overwhelmed by household objects. And so all of the subject matter comes from the home, all the objects she uses. So she creates these elaborate sets in front of the camera in her studio. And they look like they're made with real people, but they're actually made with mannequins, which can be a conceptual idea in and of itself. And they're meant to become a little bit absurd, trapping the female. Her demise looms large as she is inevitably done in by her own possessions and obsessions. And her home has become the site of claustrophobic perfectionism, leading to tragedy and danger, scenes of horror. They're meant to be playful, but at the same time as talk about somewhat serious subjects. So she's thinking about how consumerism or the objects we collect are things that might end up overwhelming us. And she usually camouflages the figure in things like drapery or other household objects. And she blames growing up in the suburbs of Chicago as the inspiration for her work. The suburbs. So they touch on contemporary issues of consumption and thinking about women having obsessions or becoming a victim of their own obsessions. Also playing with stereotypes in that way. Where she is no longer in control of her life, but in a system of mayhem. So the fact that she uses mannequins also really can relate to the feminist theory of objectification, thinking about seeing or treating a person as an object, or in this case, a domestic doll made to be beautiful or to serve, but valued as lesser or secondary or less visible. In contrast, Ghada Amer was born to a Muslim family in Egypt and raised in France, and she's now works in New York City. And she works in embroidery and painting combined. And she became well known in the 1990s to 2000s because she started creating work that was about female sexuality, which you might not be able to tell by looking at it at first, because the imagery is camouflaged by the threads of the embroidery. So you might be able to see things if you look for a little while and try to find the imagery. But the work frequently addresses femininity, sexuality, and Islamic culture. So they're meant to be provocative. She uses sewing and embroidery that she learned from her mother and grandmother, so traditional domestic skill. But instead of associate with women's work, she is instead celebrating and asserting women into the world. And so the imagery is actually traced from pornography that she has appropriated since the 1990s, where naked women are in ecstasy and usually nude. You might be able to find them in there. But she's really talking about objectification associated with these images and trying to flip where the woman is instead, there are no men in the images. There are only the women, pleasuring themselves or with other women. So the objectification is kind of flipped in that way. But at the same time, the figures are hidden by the threads. This one you can see the most easily. Where the threads that normally would be on the back side of the fabric, she leaves hanging like hair over the figures that help camouflage the figures and mask them. So she talks about how sexuality has always been on her mind because she comes from a society where it was taboo and never mentioned. And so everything forbidden is always desired. And so she's been attracted to what she was forbidden. In this case, combined with a wall, there's actually, several figures. Like this is like the size of one figure here. Really, this idea of kind of being trapped in a way with the combination of the wall. So the threads are like dripping paint, but also create this web over the figure that disguises it. So she's not creating images that are obviously pornographic, but she's still doing that as a little bit of rebellion to how she was raised. And this one says, "I am just a person trapped inside a woman's body." Over and over it says that. From a man's perspective, you have some work commenting on gender. This is Kyle Meyer's work, and he's someone who identifies as gay, and his work is rooted in thinking about how he grew up in a conservative community in Ohio, and then he spent his adult life in Swaziland, where it's actually illegal to be homosexual in Swaziland, an African country. It's even more conservative than other countries surrounding it in Africa. So he has this contradiction in the type of upbringing and the place where he spent his adult life. So he started creating portraits of people in Swaziland that are part of the LGBTQ community, and incorporated the Swazi craft of weaving with his photography. So these are actually photographs woven with fabric. The two are interwoven, so that's why the title of the series is called Interwoven. So given that homosexuality is illegal in their country, the men are constantly told to suppress their identity. So the process that he uses to photograph their portraits camouflages them to an extent where you can't quite see them clearly, but at the same time they're woven in with their cultural identity of the fabric. So first he'll take someone who volunteers to be part of this project, and he'll ask them to choose a piece of local fabric that traditionally would be worn by women as a head wrap. And instead, the men, these are largely portraits of men wearing head wraps that would traditionally be worn by women. And so that in and of itself is taboo. If they did that in public, that would be a sign of homosexual tendencies and would actually be dangerous to them. So after photographing them, he prints the photograph very large, and then he shreds the photograph and then shreds the head wrap fabric. So literally shredding the tradition or the culture and weaving them together. So these are just details of the works where you can see the frayed fabric. And the faces you can see are looking straight on to the viewer. You know, instead of taking their gaze in a more submissive pose, they're looking straight on. So these complex patterns are both from the original fabric designs, but also the weaving kind of contrasting in that way. So this craft is something that he actually originally started out as an apprenticeship with local handicraft companies that make baskets and rugs in Swaziland. I think the country now is named Eswatini, but they have the name changed recently. So each man's gaze is directly on the viewer while being hidden by the fabric as a metaphor for this kind of suppression that they have in their everyday lives. And this gives you an impression of the scale of the pieces that he creates. They're like probably about 6 feet high. So he wants to create an interwoven tension between the necessity of the individual to hide their queerness, but also the survival and wanting to express themselves openly, and also honor them through portraiture. So with the final portrait, he presents each man's individuality and beauty while using the fabric to camouflage and protect them. This last section of artists are artists who utilize disruptive patterning, which is a form of camouflage that works by breaking up the figure and the background with strongly contrasting patterning to confuse the viewer's perception. So Stephanie Sajuko, for example, works in sculpture, installation, and photography, and creates friction between ideals and everyday materials, and also thinking about consumerism and power hierarchies. So recently she focused on image-based processes and thinking about how images create art constructs about race and history as well, especially if we think about who has been photographed in history or painted in history, and how that has shaped how we think about cultures. So this series is called Cargo Cults, where she revisits historical ethnographic studio portraiture with a fictional display. So the outfits are actually, which you can kind of see a price tag here, the outfits are made from fabrics that fashions that she buys from shopping malls and places like H&M, Urban Outfitters. Trying to see my notes here. She will buy these outfits from shopping malls and then buys them on credit cards and returns them for full value. So she uses them just for the costumes, and is doing that a little bit to kind of be rebellious against consumerism as well. But she's talking about how the fact that many fashions today are derived from other cultures, the designs that we're wearing are appropriated from other cultures, and so she's recreating these kind of ethnic photography that you might see in like National Geographic with these outfits that are bought from shopping malls and kind of reconfigured. And so she says that this technique that she uses is a reworking of dazzle camouflage, which is a World War I technique of painting battleships with graphic black and white patterns in order to confuse the enemy and disrupt their view so that they cannot be seen from the background. And so the viewer has a hard time finding the subject. So this This technique actually saved many battleships that, compared to battleships that were not painted in dazzle camouflage, there were like 70% less of them sunk when they used this technique. So Sajuko uses that's her influence in the black and white photography for these kinds of designs of conflicting patternings. And one other series she has is very specific to thinking about immigration and passport photos especially. So this kind of block of 6 is referencing getting your passport photograph taken. So she's thinking about standardized identification photos that you're required to submit along with an application for immigration, travel, or asylum. And so the migrants in the passport photos are completely covered. Their identity is disguised. And so that serves a dual purpose: to elude identification and remain anonymous in an era of surveillance and tracking. But also to reference the ways that migrants and refugees have been depicted as faceless, anonymous, instead of individuals. You can see how she's trying to recreate these kind of ethnic outfits as well, but still made with the fabrics from shopping malls. And this, you can see the scale of the piece is the same size as something like a passport photograph. So another artist that is thinking about this idea of migration or immigration is Drawry Mania, who is, I believe, from Florida, and she creates a series of color photographs, often combined with poetic texts that reflect on the immigrant experience. So the series called Containers has figures that are performing in fabrics, bodysuits that completely cover them, but also reference nature. So this piece, for example, has a text that goes with it that says camouflage, or how to lose your native accent in 5 quick steps. So she's talking a lot about assimilation and the work that minorities or immigrants have to go through to try to fit in or blend in with culture in that way, and thinking about how people are not counted or not considered within culture. So in this case, the figure is instead more contrasting the background and really standing out. And she had a performance where she had several women of Dominican background, like herself, that did performances where people were walking around and they were kind of laying around the gardens and the outside of the museum that they would encounter. She says, on the other hand, to be configured in the gaze of the dominant class, gender, race as glaringly and unforgivably different, exceptional, exotic, is also to have one's agency, that is, the ability to enact one's will on the world, corralled in other ways. Though I have lived in the United States for about 34 years, I have never come close to solving this mess, and the question of what to do, how to remake myself every day to escape being swallowed up by this quandary is a question that clearly plagues other immigrants in this country. How to fit in or not fit in, how much to keep your native identity versus the new culture that you've moved to. So she's thinking about that as being like a labor that people go through every day to kind of assimilate into the culture that they're living in. This one I think is a little bit darker because it looks a little bit like a corpse at the same time. Her photography and text get a unique kind of labor that, thinking about the labor one has to go through or perform, and this idea of othering. And so it indicates how one day we'll hopefully be able to gauge how to not have to do that kind of a work anymore, where the status of an immigrant will not be thought of in the same way. So the last artist I'm showing is Kiyoma Ham, who is another artist from Korea. She grew up in Seoul, South Korea in the 1970s, and occasionally growing up she would find propaganda leaflets sent from North Korea, because as you know, South Korea and North Korea were divided, and they are really kind of meant to be enemies in a way. Very different outlooks on how to live life. So South Korea is more like the US in a way, and North Korea being more communist. So she would pick up these leaflets and bring them to school, where she was given a reward for helping with the ideological war with her neighbor by picking up those leaflets. That had kind of gone away for a while, and in 2008 she found another North Korean leaflet under the gate of her parents' home, and it felt like an alien object blown in from a different planet. By then, she was an artist who had come to distrust much of the history that she'd been taught, and also knew that South Koreans were also sending their own leaflets over the border. But she started to think about, can I communicate with people across the border? Because these people are supposed to be my enemies. They're people I'll never be able to meet. And so she has found a way to collaborate on artworks with people from North Korea. And so she actually, and this tragedy, this geopolitical tragedy, this separation between countries goes back 65 years, and is so ingrained that she could, be imprisoned for the process that she uses to create her artwork, because she actually hires people from North Korea to create her artworks as a collaboration with her. So in North Korea, for example, embroidery is highly encouraged because it's a traditional skill. So this is an embroidery. So every color you see, those are fine stitches stitched into the fabric. And these pieces are pretty huge as well. If you can't see, there's actually text in here, because this is a series called SMS Text, or SMS series, which are based off of the idea of like text messaging and how we communicate to each other through text messages. This is a close-up of the fabric where you can see the stitches, and this is the back side of the fabric here. But just to show you how tiny these stitches are on a scale, that's looking really close up at the fabric. So this idea of thinking about how to communicate with her neighbors became a collaboration that for a decade she's been producing designs on the computer. She has the designs printed like maps and sent to her North Korean neighbors, where she's found intermediaries that are allowed to go across the border, and has even used bribes in order to get the artwork back and forth. So it usually takes about a year to get the artwork back from sending it across the border. And in North Korea, embroidery is encouraged, traditional skills are encouraged, but abstract art is actually taboo and forbidden. So artwork like this is actually not acceptable in North Korea, and these women working on these embroideries could actually go to prison or even possibly be executed for working on these pieces. But she is kind of like a spy master, that she actually has figured out a way to work with people in a hidden, kind of cloak and dagger way to get the artwork made. So for example, one of her pieces says "Big Smile," which was instructions given to performers during the mass games, the Olympic Games, to kind of like smile for the camera. So she's found a way to work with these artisans through different subterfuge. The artworks are smuggled in black plastic bags and initially reek of cigarette smoke. And many of them have been confiscated by North Korean authorities. So they're eventually stretched on canvas and sold at art galleries so that she can pay the workers. But originally they're like bundled up in black plastic bags. So she's world known now, and her work has been, I first saw her work at Art Basel Art Fair. And in the works are words that are woven in, like text messages. So it's her way of communicating with her neighbors, people that she'll never get to meet, and the messages are woven in. And so they say things like, "Are you lonely too?" This one says, I'm trying to read it, "Thou, if you are like me." It's a little bit of, maybe a little bit of an English translation, but there's also Korean language in the bottom half, if you can't tell. So these are other examples here. On one level, the embroideries are an attempt to reunite her art with people who have been forcibly separated through war, and marries the strength of the South, of technology, working on the computer, with the strength of the North through the craftsmanship. But they go through a hazard-filled maze to be created. So she could face criminal prosecution, but the penalties for the people creating them are even graver if they were to be caught. And so she protects the network of people, but she's really thinking about uniting and creating artworks that can memorialize or immortalize the skills of both of their countries and really unify them and bring them together. And these works are seen all over the world and outside of where they originate. So these skills of these women in North Korea who have very traditional embroidery skills would normally never be seen outside of their country. But she's also thinking about this idea of uniting across borders. So in conclusion, this represents just a sampling of artists across the globe that share a common aesthetic and a common goal, and use this kind of aesthetic language to get their messages across. They all use attractive and complex aesthetics and creatively express the necessity for us to see each other and continue to have empathy amidst overwhelming factors, our busy schedules, the continual bombardment of media interfaces and image saturation and broadcasts of global distresses. They bring awareness to both the violence and the humanity that is within all of us, paving the way for a more enlightened future. So I appreciate you bearing with me, so that I know there are a lot of images in there. So does anybody have questions on that specifically yet? Okay, well, thank you for your attention. So next we're gonna
Announce the awards.
announce the awards. Okay, just didn't want to
Say
that.
the honors?
No, I wanted to make sure. So
Would you like to do the honors?
whatever you want. Okay. So, and those of you who are here that are artists, I really appreciate your courage in participating in group shows and showing your work, because it always takes courage to be a part of a public art exhibition, and because you put so much love into your works. So first of all, honorable mentions. The first one is La Posada by Rita Shapiro, which is in the other gallery, and it has a grid of 4 paintings with kind of meditative mark makings. The second honorable mention is Australia is Burning, which is actually right next to me here, by Beatrice McClellan. And that is based off of current events with the fire in Australia. The third honorable mention is Assault on the Scarlet Petticoat by Carolyn Davis, which is right over here by the ceramic pieces, and she has another ceramic piece behind me here. And as far as the third place award goes to Susan Moss, who, I don't know if I'm pronouncing the name right, or Susan Moss. But she has a fiber work in the other room called Not Art 5, which is a little bit of a play on words if you look at that. Second place goes to Dancing Crown by Harris Wiltshire, which is actually the central print in this set of 3. It's a beautiful screen print if you look at it close up, because those are done with traditional type of screen printing where the stencil is painted instead of using computer or photography. And then first place goes to Protect Us by Stephanie Cunningham, which again is in the other gallery. And that is a grid of text-based works. And if you look close up at those, there's a very labor-intensive process in the making of those. So those are very difficult to choose. But because there were definitely several more artists I wanted to give awards to, but I appreciate everyone's hard work in the works that were in the exhibition. I'm pretty pleased with how the show looks. So
It looks great, thank you.
yeah. So when you have time, please take time to look at the works, and there's a lot to see.
There is, and thank you all for taking your time to be with us, and thank you, Lisa.
say hello or talk about anything.
Do you ever look at a picture on there and then you say,